It's an image seared into national consciousness. The endless tent cities of Los Angeles, the subway car encampments of New York City. The United States has a massive, heartbreaking homeless crisis, but its geography is starkly uneven. New York and California, two states representing less than 15% of the total U.S. population, routinely account for over one-third of the nation's entire homeless population. Why? Why do two of the richest, most liberal states that collectively spend billions trying to solve the problem, dominate this epidemic of human despair? This is not just a tale of high housing costs. It's a profound story of divergent policies, historical legacies, unique demographics, and the sheer magnetic pull of climate and opportunity that concentrates poverty in the very places that have become unaffordable for the working class. This is the New York-California problem, and its roots go far deeper than a single economic recession or political cycle. Understanding this divergence is the key to understanding the American homeless crisis itself, and the stakes could not be higher. The stark numbers, shelter versus street. The first thing to understand about the dominance of New York and California is how differently their crises manifest, a distinction fundamentally driven by policy. As of the most recent point in time counts, California has the largest total number of homeless individuals, often accounting for roughly 30% of the national total. But here's the critical data point. Over two-thirds of California's homeless population is unsheltered, meaning they are sleeping in places not meant for human habitation, on the streets, in cars, or in tents. New York, on the other hand, consistently reports a significantly smaller, though still massive, unsheltered population, with over 90% of its homeless individuals staying in emergency shelters, transitional housing, or safe havens. This difference is not a miracle of superior New York empathy. It is a direct result of a landmark 1981 court decree, the Callahan versus Carey settlement, which established a legal right to shelter in New York City. This mandate obligates the city to provide a bed for every eligible homeless person. California has no such statewide mandate, nor do its major cities. This single policy difference explains the entire visible disparity. In New York, the crisis is largely hidden inside massive, strained shelter systems. In California, the crisis is visible out on the street, creating the iconic, sprawling encampments that shock the world. The New York system is overwhelmed by sheer volume. The California system is struggling with the raw, brutal reality of unsheltered poverty and its associated public health nightmares. The unsheltered crisis in California drives a public perception problem and a vastly different set of public safety and public health issues compared to New York's predominantly sheltered crisis, though both are failing their most vulnerable citizens. The economic avalanche. Housing is the root cause. While individual circumstances like addiction, mental illness, and job loss are often the proximate causes of homelessness, nearly all experts agree that the root cause in both states is a severe, systemic lack of deeply affordable housing. New York City and the major metropolitan areas of California, Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, are among the most expensive housing markets on the planet. The problem boils down to a fundamental imbalance between supply and demand, intensified by restrictive local zoning and development policies often referred to as NIMBYism, not in my backyard. Both states, due to their economic dynamism and attractiveness, have massive job markets and high-earning populations, which drives up demand. However, both states have failed, for decades, to build enough housing to keep pace with that demand. In California, complex regulatory processes, environmental reviews like the California Environmental Quality Act, (SECA), and powerful local opposition have strangled new construction, particularly multifamily and affordable housing. In New York, though the mechanisms differ, the result is the same: the construction of housing that caters to the high-end market, leaving the bottom of the market to crumble under astronomical rents. For the very poor, who are often working low-wage service jobs in these same high-cost cities, a single financial shock, an unexpected medical bill, a small-scale eviction, a job cut, is all it takes to push them past the precipice and into the streets. The gap between minimum wage and a market-rate rent is wider in these two states than almost anywhere else in the NADI. On the policy fork in the road, New York's right to shelter versus California's housing first. The policy responses of the two states, while both generous in intent, have created two different sets of challenges. New York's right to shelter is a moral promise, but it carries an immense logistical and financial burden. The city must maintain a vast infrastructure of temporary housing, which costs billions annually. This mandate prioritizes immediate, guaranteed temporary shelter, but critics argue it inadvertently creates a large, perpetually cycling population who live in shelters but never transition to permanent housing due to sheer lack of affordable exits. New York must constantly expand its emergency shelters, which often lack the supportive services needed to address the underlying issues of chronic homelessness, and which now also strain under the recent massive influx of asylum seekers, a new variable specific to New York's international port status. California, in contrast, has fully embraced the housing-first model, an evidence-based approach that prioritizes getting people into permanent, independent housing with supportive services without preconditions like sobriety or employment. This is widely considered the most effective long-term solution for chronic homelessness. However, California's implementation is hamstrung by its own housing crisis. Housing First requires affordable housing units to house people in, and as established, those units are scarce and excruciatingly expensive to build, often costing $500,000 to $800,000 per unit in urban areas. The result is that California has adopted a philosophy without the infrastructure to execute at scale. Services and housing are decentralized and often uncoordinated across hundreds of local jurisdictions, leading to a patchwork system that fails to meet the overwhelming need, leaving the vast majority of people unsheltered while they wait for non-existent house. The deinstitutionalization legacy and mental health crisis. Another historical factor heavily influencing the homeless demographics in both states is the legacy of deinstitutionalization. Starting in the mid-20th century, both states, following national trends, closed large state mental hospitals, shifting care from institutions to community-based mental health centers. The fatal flaw was that the community centers were never adequately funded or established. Millions of people with severe mental illnesses were released with nowhere to go. New York and California, with their large urban centers, became magnets for this vulnerable population. Today, a disproportionately high number of the chronically homeless in both states suffer from serious mental illness and substance use disorders. In California, the visibility of the unsheltered crisis means the intertwined issues of addiction and mental illness are extremely public, driving public discourse and frustration. The lack of readily available, high-quality, long-term psychiatric and addiction treatment centers, the result of that failed deinstitutionalization, means that a significant portion of the homeless population has no functional safety net outside of the emergency room, the jail, or the street. Climate and the magnet effect. The invisible pull. One factor that is often overlooked but profoundly impacts the concentration of unsheltered homelessness in California is the climate. The mild temperate weather of coastal California cities like Los Angeles and San Diego provides a far more survivable environment for sleeping outdoors year-round than the brutal, freezing winters of New York. In New York, the weather itself provides an immediate life-or-death imperative to seek shelter, reinforcing the use of the mandated shelter system. In California, while conditions are far from comfortable, they are survivable, which reduces the urgency for many unsheltered individuals to enter restrictive or low-quality shelters. This creates a powerful, albeit tragic, magnet effect where individuals experiencing homelessness or on the brink of it may migrate to a warmer climate, further concentrating the unsheltered population in California's major cities. This concentration then strains local resources, services, and public patience to a breaking point. The role of systemic inequities. The crisis is also inseparable from systemic inequities. Both states have stark racial and ethnic disparities within their homeless populations. Black, Indigenous, and Hispanic/Latinx communities are overwhelmingly overrepresented among the homeless relative to their share of the general population. This is not a coincidence. It is a direct consequence of historical and ongoing systemic discrimination in housing, employment, and the criminal justice system. Factors that create generational poverty and instability. Redlining and discriminatory lending practices of the past force these communities into substandard, undervalued housing markets. Today, discriminatory rental practices, coupled with lower generational wealth, mean that these groups have fewer resources to withstand economic shocks in a high-cost environment. In California, the problem is compounded by the high incarceration rates that disproportionately affect minority communities, creating significant barriers to employment and housing upon release. The homeless crisis is, in many ways, an unvarnished reflection of these deeper, unresolved social and economic inequalities that are particularly severe and visible in the hyperdiverse, hyper-expensive urban centers of New York and California. The Golden State's quandary, California's unique struggles. California's homelessness crisis is often characterized by its high unsheltered rate and its concentration in major metropolitan areas like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego. Several factors converge to create this dire situation. Firstly, the astronomical cost of housing is arguably the single most significant driver. The median home price in many parts of California is well over double the national average, and rent for even a modest apartment can consume an overwhelming portion of a low or even middle-income earner's salary. This isn't just a byproduct of desirability. It's a consequence of decades of insufficient housing construction, restrictive zoning laws, and fierce NIMBYism, not in my backyard opposition to new development. These factors have created an acute housing supply shortage that simply cannot keep pace with demand, pushing prices ever higher and making stable housing unattainable for a growing segment of the population. When a single unexpected expense or job loss can be the difference between paying rent and living on the streets, the margin for error for millions of Californians becomes perilously thin. Secondly, California's climate, while a draw for many, also contributes to its unsheltered crisis. The relatively mild weather year-round, particularly in Southern California, means that surviving outdoors is more feasible than in states with harsh winters. While this might sound like a minor detail, it inadvertently reduces the immediate, life-threatening pressure to seek shelter, leading to larger visible encampments. This isn't to say people choose homelessness, but rather that the climate allows for a degree of outdoor survival that might be impossible elsewhere, potentially reducing the urgency for some to engage with shelter systems that can often be restrictive or perceived as unsafe. The Empire State's Enigma, New York's shelter crisis. New York's homelessness problem, particularly concentrated in New York City, presents a different but equally challenging picture. Unlike California, New York has a unique legal framework, a right to shelter mandate, largely stemming from the 1981 Callahan v. Carey consent decree. This landmark legal decision requires New York City to provide shelter to every eligible homeless man, woman, and child who seeks it. While this policy prevents the widespread unsheltered encampment seen in California, it has created an enormous, expensive, and perpetually strained shelter system. New York City's shelter population often hovers around 60,000 individuals nightly, sometimes soaring higher, especially with recent influxes of asylum seekers. This system, while a vital safety net, consumes billions of dollars annually, funds that some argue could be better spent on preventative measures and permanent housing solutions. The right to shelter is a humanitarian achievement, but also creates a significant fiscal burden and a continuous demand that often outstrips the availability of quality, permanent housing. Moving forward, the bipartisan stalemate and the path to solutions. The problem of homelessness in New York and California is not a failure of money. Both states spend enormous, unprecedented sums, but a failure of coordination, infrastructure, and political will to tackle the housing supply issue at its core. New York needs to fundamentally change its shelter-first approach to create more permanent exits, utilizing its wealth to build more supportive housing and streamline the transition process. California needs to stop simply spending money on a broken process and instead focus ruthlessly on accelerating construction of affordable housing by reforming its Byzantine zoning laws and regulatory hurdles. The political discourse in both states often gets mired in a stale, unproductive debate between service provision, mental health, addiction treatment, and structural solutions, housing supply. The reality, proven by successful models elsewhere, is that both must be tackled simultaneously, with housing as a non-negotiable foundation. Until these two states, the bellwethers of American liberal policy, can overcome their unique policy failures and their shared housing supply crisis, they will continue to dominate the national homelessness narrative, their success and wealth tragically juxtaposed against the thousands of human lives wasting away on their streets and in their crowded shelters. The ultimate solution rests not in more mandates or more compassion, but in the political courage to break the barriers preventing construction of a simple, affordable home.